chance that he could have existed. We just don't have the evidence to actually bump that up to more than likely.
Okay. So what would you expect to see if Jesus did exist?
I would expect to see some kind of textual reference to a Jesus prior to his supposed death.
Okay. So why would that be an expectation?
Well, I mean, if you have people that are writing about Jesus, about his gospel and everything like that, and we also have like Josephus. Josephus writes about several different Messiah figures that are failed Messiah figures. So, I mean, if Jesus was truly like some kind of figure, like an itinerant rabbi that was going around preaching about how he is the Messiah and everything like that, we should expect there to be somebody to take notice and write it down, at least as just a mention. Even if it was like, oh, there's this guy named Jesus who, failed to, fulfill the prophecies and all this other stuff. I would think that we would see that kind of reference to Jesus from either outside sources or even directly from like Paul. I think Paul is your best case for a historical Jesus.
So let me ask this. So one of the cases that I present fundamentally, like you're someone who believes Paul existed. So
Yeah.
the person I'm debating on Friday does not. When you look at 1 Corinthians 15, and scholars are pretty consistent. I'm not sure what your view is on it, but they're pretty consistent that it's an oral tradition that's being passed down very early on, within like 1 to 5 years after the cross.
Well, yeah.
Right.
Where does 1 Corinthians 15 say it's getting its information from?
Well, it's an oral tradition. So we can say that there's
oral,
like.
Sorry to interrupt, but within that oral tradition, it says like it gives a source for the information. Do you recall what that source is?
Yeah, so I delivered unto you what I also received, and that's referencing like Paul is saying he received the information.
Well,
if that's
he
what
received the information. No. I'm talking about if you go further into 1 Corinthians 15, it says according to the scriptures.
Yeah. So what would be? Oh, okay. So you're just referencing. Like, I'm not totally familiar with your position. I'll just let you go ahead and clarify.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, it says like if you look at the interlinear, like the original Greek, it says according to the scriptures, like as if it's citing where it's getting this information from. So, like when it says that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, it's saying that, well, the scriptures say that Christ is going to die for our sins. And then when it says, that he was buried and that he was raised on the third day, according to the scriptures. So whatever scriptures that they're reading in order to generate this early oral tradition or this early creed, they're saying that the scriptures dictate that these things are happening. And then it goes on to the list of people that Jesus appeared to after he resurrected, and that would be Peter first, and then the 12, which is ambiguous. We don't know who these 12 are, who they represent, or anything like that. And then to the more than 500, which, I mean, I dispute the 500 claim. I think that it was about Jesus appearing over the Pentecost and not to 500 people. But, that's that we can discuss that some other time.
Well, before we go further down the 1 Corinthians train, I did want to just ask one other clarifying question.
Sure.
So you said something that would like move the needle for you, or that would be expected, is if we had writings about Jesus before he died, right? So if it was the case, just hypothetically, if it was the case that this oral tradition is being passed out just a few years after he died, and you like discovered that this was authentic, would that move the needle for you?
I mean, what would move the needle for me is that, they referenced something other than scriptures here, because it's the scriptures part is my hang up, is the fact that they're claiming that the scriptures say this will happen. And so like that, like the scriptures are saying that this will happen. The scriptures say that Christ will die. The scriptures are saying, or that Christ has died. And the scriptures say that Christ was buried and he raised on the third day. Like it's telling us that scriptures dictate that those things will happen, or that they have happened rather.
Yeah. So, I mean, one take you can follow, and this is kind of a separate question, but if we're just looking at the scripture notion, one take you can follow is that they're just saying Jesus said these things, and Jesus's words therefore are scriptures. Another take you can follow, but the more important question is whether or not the oral tradition is being passed down early on. So whether or not the scriptures, like if we say, let me just like concede this point and say, let's say there were no like physical scriptures, and they're just like throwing this out and they're making it part of the oral tradition, and there are no scriptures, right? Conceding that point, if we still ask the question, why is an oral tradition being passed around about a specific Christ figure, and why is it being received by Paul?
Well, no, I mean, they're not being specific about the Christ figure, because the Christ figure is just the Christ figure of Judaism. It's the same archangel figure that Philo identified in his Logos. I mean, they're not being specific. Like, they're not saying Jesus here. They're saying Christ, meaning the Messiah. So, I mean, they're not being specific. And also, I wouldn't agree that there were no scriptures. I'm saying that there were scriptures, and these scriptures aren't going to be confused with oral tradition, because then what it would be like, oh, I received this information from this person, like, by word of mouth, or like, I however they would mention like being given orally, like this information. They wouldn't say in accordance, or not in accordance. They're changing the words from Greek there, but according to the scriptures. That the scriptures were very specific to these early Jews. It wasn't that they were definitely not saying, oh, oral tradition is scripture. Like, that's not what they were saying.
Well, so when we're looking at it, let's break it down like piece by piece. So in verse 3, for I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. We agree this is Paul, right?
Right.
Okay. I delivered to you as a first important what I also received. So he's delivering a message that he's gotten from somewhere. Now, something we do know within Paul's history is he's directly connected to some of the disciples, such as Cephas. Now, I can't remember, do you think that the disciples existed, or do you reject the disciples' existence in reference to like Paul's relationship with them?
Considering Paul never uses the word disciple, I don't think that he has any relation to any disciples. I think he has relations to apostles, which are different than disciples, but Paul never uses the word disciple and never describes anybody as a disciple.
Okay, so when it's referencing Cephas and it's referencing the 12, who do you think that that's in reference to? Do you think it's just some random group of people to which it's disassociated?
No, actually, I would, as far as the 12 goes, I don't know. He could be talking about representatives of the 12 tribes. Then to because there were 12 tribes, so like he could be talking about Jesus appearing to the 12 tribes of Israel. Cephas, or Peter, I think, was a person that received a vision or hallucination of a resurrected Jesus.
Okay. So the appearance, you're taking them to be just like spiritual, right? Again, I'm not totally, I've heard you a couple times. I'm not totally familiar with your position.
Right. I mean, the visions or the all that would be like not exactly like visions in general are considered to be, I guess, spiritual experiences, or experiences that are not necessarily reflective of what's happening in the real world. Because I don't think that Acts is historical, but just a good example of that would be what happens to Paul on the Damascus Road in Acts. It describes there that Paul had this vision or this experience with Jesus on the road to Damascus, and it was only him that had that experience, and it was not present in the reality around him as like a physical, like real thing. The other people that were with him did not see those things happen or see Jesus appear to Paul. So I mean, that's what I guess that's the typological thing that I think of when I think of vision. It's something that is very localized to the person experiencing the vision, and it's not anything that's happening like in the physical reality on Earth.
Okay, so when we go further down into First Corinthians, and then we can go back up, but when we go further down into First Corinthians, what do you think it means when it constantly is repeating the notion? So we're leaving the oral tradition, but now we're actually talking about how the oral tradition connects to the rest of the context. So when it talks about now if Christ is preached, that he has been raised from the dead, how do so among you say there is no resurrection of the dead? And then he continues to repeat this phrase over and over in verse 14. If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is in vain. In verse 17, in verse 15, in verse 16, he's constantly using this in reference to, okay, there is a death and there's something that's raising up. So how do you understand that?
Well, so as far as I'm not exactly sure about this particular, because I mean, this just sounds like it's resurrection sort of discussion here. I don't think that the resurrection actually happened or anything like that, but I do think that Paul considered Jesus to have been unalived in the firmament of the heavens and buried in the heavens by Satan and his demons, and then from there he resurrected up into the upper levels of heaven to be seated at the right hand of the Father.
Okay, so if you're going to say like it's spiritual, why is it connected to the physical?
I don't think that it is connected to the physical. Well, so as far as like spiritual,
So
well,
when
hold on. Well, I just want to
Yeah.
be specific here. So when I say spiritual or this divine kind of thing, I think that Paul, these first century Christians, did consider the divine to be physical beings, but they were physical beings in the firmament and up, like like the heavens was not like a spiritual place in an incorporeal sense. Spiritual places were both incorporeal and corporeal, being that the divine realm started at the firmament and continued on up through the different levels of heaven. And so Paul considered Jesus in his pre-resurrection state to be a corporeal being in the firmament. When he resurrected, he ascended back up into the upper levels of heaven, shedding, the corporeal nature into this incorporeal being that exists at the highest levels of heaven. And so, like when Jesus is revealing himself to the apostles in the New Testament, he is a spiritual being, meaning that he is an incorporeal being that is revealing himself there. So when Jesus did the actual resurrecting, he was a corporeal person in the, or corporeal divine being in the firmament. And it's only after his resurrection and his ascension back up into the upper levels of heaven does he become incorporeal.
Okay, so I think you misunderstood what question I was asked. So I wanted to clarify. When it says in verse 12, now if Christ is preached that he's been raised from the dead, how do some among you say there is no resurrection of the dead? But there is no resurrection of the dead, not even if Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain. Your faith is also in vain, right?
Okay.
So on this verse, and specifically when we look at like Jewish theology, right? Because Paul would have had like obviously. Sorry, give me 1 second. A child has entered.
That's okay. Hey there, AC. How you doing? I'm doing pretty good. I agree with KC Gleason. Children come first. My son would come first, but he's a teenager now, and he only needs me when he requires food.
Okay, I'm back. I'm sorry.
You're fine.
Yeah. So anyway, so the question I'm asking is, if we understand Jewish theology, we understand that there's a denial of a physical resurrection of the dead, right? That the physical resurrection of the dead that's taking place in verse 12 is exactly like this point. So the contention in Judaism is going to be whether or not there is a physical resurrection of the dead. And so Paul in verse 12 is saying, hey, there's some among you who are saying there's no physical resurrection of the dead, because that was the point of contradiction and contention. Right. And then he continues on from that point and says, well, if you're going to say there's no physical resurrection of the dead, and if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain. But if Christ has been raised, then our preaching is not in vain, right? And that raised is being directly indexed toward that notion of physical raising and physical death.
Okay. Well, I mean, I feel like, do you think that you could steelman what I said about Paul's concept of Jesus's resurrection in relation to that?
Yeah. So as I understood it, you said that Jesus is raised, but not physically. Like there's the different levels. You have shape.
I'm sorry, that's not what I said. I said that when Jesus was resurrected, he had a physical body in the firmament it was still a divine body, but Paul, as well as other Jews at that time, definitely considered, the lower parts of heaven to be a corporeal, physical place. And after he resurrected, he then ascended, right? He resurrected physically. When he ascended to the upper levels of heaven, just like when he descended from the upper levels of heaven, in a converse fashion, he resurrected up to the upper levels of heaven, where he became more incorporeal as he went up into heaven, and he eventually shed his physical body and became incorporeal and like spirit.
So this is similar to Carrier's view. Do you?
Well, yeah.
Right. Okay. All right. I understand. So, can you point to a source? And I'm not asking, like, even you don't have to do it on the spot if you can't remember or something. Can you point to a source that's going to represent, like, this notion of Judaism believing that there's a question of whether or not a physical body is raising from the dead in Sheol or in the firmament, as you're referencing?
Well, so there in the life of Moses, or the apocalypse of Adam, is it the apocalypse of Moses or the life? No, it's the life of Adam and Eve, which is also named the apocalypse of Moses. It has Adam's body being buried in the heavens. And of course, Adam's body doesn't resurrect, but there is this notion of physical bodies being buried in heaven. And in fact, you have Paul, I think it's in Corinthians, but Paul actually says that Eden, the paradise, is actually located in the third heaven. And so, like, even all up to the third heaven, do you have physical, beings that inhabit there?
So the third heaven in Judaism, because there's like 7 levels of heaven.
Right.
The third heaven represents like the universe, and they had this notion of like that's where God was where the stars.
God wasn't in the third heaven; he was in the seventh heaven.
Or well, yes. So the third heaven is. I'm sorry, I misspoke. The third heaven in represented is going to be the universe. The seventh heaven, you're absolutely right, is going to be like where the throne of God is, where the celestial city is.
That's not exactly accurate to cosmology. They associated the different levels of heaven to different orbits of the planetary bodies. And so the third heaven would have most likely been I believe it's either Venus or it's the sun, one of the other, I believe. And there's like different texts out there where you could interpret them to be either the sun or the Venus, but that would be the extent of the third heaven, would be out to those particular planetary bodies. So I don't think that it's accurate to say that the third heaven represents the entirety of the universe. They didn't really have a concept of the entirety of the universe at that point. as far as I know about it. Maybe you know something different, but I definitely think that, it was a very geocentric sort of view that these early first century Jews and Jewish Christians had.
Okay, so going back to the actual chapter and reference, because I do understand the view now. What do you think is more parsimonious? And by parsimonious, I just mean the least amount of assumptions that is actually taking place within the text, right? The least amount of assumptions that you have to have for an auxiliary hypothesis before forming, like.
Yeah, I know what parsimony is.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that working off of what information we have from both Jewish scriptures that are extant to us now, or that are revealed by, other people quoting Jewish sources, or directly by like the Apostle Paul himself. So like, I mean, I guess as far as parsimony goes, I think that it's whatever's in line with what early Jews and Jewish Christians thought about the cosmology of the universe. And from what it seems like, all of the scriptures seem to point out this very specific cosmology of there being a firmament. I mean, so maybe we should start there. Do you agree that first century Jews and Jewish Christians eventually believed in a firmament?
Yes and no. So there was
no.
obvious. Yeah, there was obvious debate among different Jewish sects on whether or not there was a firmament still intact, in the sense, because there's different Jewish commentaries you can read where, when you get into the story of Noah, like there's the breaking of the firmament, and some people reference that at that point the firmament was broken in Judaism, and the firmament is no longer it's no longer something that's persisting.
Do you think that Paul would have described being taken up to the third heaven in a vision, by God, and he didn't know if it was a bodily, like a bodily traveling to the third heaven, or if it was just in the vision that he was given from God, but he was taken up to the third heaven where where paradise is? I mean, do you think that, given that even up to paradise is physical, regardless of whether or not the firmament was quote unquote broken, you can agree that there is a physicality, like there's physical structures that extend on up into heaven?
It depends on what you mean by physical structure. So
I mean it in the same way that, what is it? Is it Ephesians, maybe? I think it's.
If you want, I can pull it up real quick.
Well, I think it's Ephesians where they talk about how there are copies of things in heaven that exist on earth, and that these that they get more perfect the farther you get up into the upper levels of heaven. And so there are copies of everything that exists on earth in heaven. The earthly copies need blood sacrifices in order to be cleansed and to be made clean. And every level of heaven leading up to the seventh level of heaven are more and more perfect copies of things that exist on earth. So it seems like at least the community that was adjacent to Paul at that time did consider there to be physical objects as you go up into the heavens.
Okay, yeah. So I have no problem with saying that heaven has some sort of physicality. Yeah, in that sense, that's no problem.
Okay. Well, then, I mean, regardless of whether or not the firmament had become shattered or whatever, it definitely first century Jews and Jewish Christians thought that the firmament was a physical place, either one time or currently. And then as you get higher and higher up, you get more incorporeal as you get up to the seventh heaven, but there are still physical planes of existence past the firmament.
So
I'm just making sure we agree on that point.
So I mean, I can't agree or disagree. It depends. Like when you say all, like that was just the fundamental like Jewish theology. I would just have to look more at that. But
Okay, definitely do, because there's verses in Paul, like the Corinth. I think it's second, maybe it's Second Corinthians. I can't remember, but he's supposedly brought up to the third heaven where he sees paradise. There's that one. There's the life of Adam and Eve, where Adam, Eve, and Seth were all three buried in paradise in the heavens. And so
I'm familiar with that. I'm
okay.
only representing that specifically in like First Corinthians and what's being mentioned here, like these notions of the third heaven, these notions of the resurrection of the dead. Those are not aligning correctly, especially like in First Corinthians, for example. Just out of curiosity, what is your answer to the notion that like Paul says Jesus died? What do you think that means? Like him being crucified?
Right. I mean, I think that he was crucified in the firmament of the heavens. So, I mean, I think that Jesus was given a body by God, much in the same way that Philo believed that Moses was given a body, a divinely constructed body. I think that Paul considered Jesus' body to be divinely constructed. And this divinely constructed body was then, inhabited by this archangel figure of Judaism. And when he went to the firmament, he was crucified and unalived by Satan and his demons in the firmament.
Okay. So I'm trying to keep up with the notion. To be honest, I don't really know how to argue. I don't know how to argue against this point. Not because
Okay.
let me clarify. Not because I think it's a good point, but it's to me, and
What
this is
part
going to
of
be
it?
subjective.
Well, sorry.
It's
Yeah.
so
Go ahead.
yeah. To me, it's so divorced from the text. It's so divorced from Paul that it's untenable.
How is it divorced from Paul?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're going to operate on like our interpretative methods just completely different.
Well, I'm just kind of curious. You think that it's divorced from Paul and how Paul's theology works. I don't see any kind of dividing line between what I just said and what Paul most likely would have considered, because we don't get like a full theology in this kind of respect from Paul. What we have are some vague verses that we can interpret one way or another, but it seems to me like Paul is definitely describing this kind of theology. And then the group that was associated with Paul, either they are students of Paul or Paul was part of that community, wrote I believe it's Ephesians, wrote Ephesians and had that particular statement in there about there being copies of physical things in heaven and everything. So it definitely seems like Paul came from a community that considered the physicality of described by Paul. He never describes as a disciple, so I'm not going to sit there and assume that he was a disciple. I would need some kind of like direct statement from Paul that he knew about him being a disciple.
Why would you need a direct statement if it's representing like, so you have this individual that represents himself like walking with Jesus, learning from Jesus.
No, where does he do
things of
that?
that? So you can see notions of it in First and Second Peter as well.
Oh yeah, I don't think that. Well, I don't see any evidence that the Peter discussed by Paul, wrote First and Second Peter. I think that historians are, they're not exactly sold on whether or not the Peter mentioned by Paul wrote those. But what I can tell you is that I don't. Since we can't verify that Peter actually wrote those and that Peter is recording actual experiences with a pre-crucified Christ or Jesus rather, I don't think that we can solidly use that as definitive proof that Peter was a disciple. And so what we can do is we can use Paul's work and the fact that Paul never references him as a disciple or any kind of like pre-crucified Jesus. That's what I think that we can be sure of.
So, what do you take on James? Do you take James as like a spiritual brother of the Lord? Like what? How do
Oh,
you take James?
oh yeah, yeah. So I mean, this probably constitutes one of the better pieces of evidence for a historical Jesus, but I think that there's still a lot of questions surrounding that. For one thing, the actual Greek that's used there doesn't actually differentiate this James from just a general brother of the Lord or a general Christian. I think that he was mentioning this James specifically not as an apostle. I think that he was delineating him from the apostle that he saw, which I believe that was Peter that he saw, that he mentioned with James. And the James in Galatians 1 is more than likely different than the James that's mentioned in Galatians 2. But this brother of the Lord, it has a lot of problems to it. As I said, the words that Paul actually used don't actually do anything to differentiate him from just a general Christian or a blood relative. I think that the Lord is a title that was only given to Jesus after he resurrected. That's when he became the Lord. And so, because of that, of course, I'm not saying that that means that we weren't talking about Jesus, but I do think that it means that he's speaking of the family of God there, and that being a brother of the Lord or being a brother of Jesus in this sense is more about being in the family of God rather than being like a blood relative to it. And the reason why I say that is because I
Nice.
believe it's
Oh,
Romans 9:5, I believe, where Paul uses the same word for brother there as he does for believing sisters. And so it kind of seems like you would need some kind of extra bit of information to say, oh, but this was a blood relative.
yeah. So we can do that based on, like you brought up Galatians 1, for example. When you look at Galatians 1, there's a reason that there's a qualifier as opposed to all of the other apostles, as opposed to Cephas, right? Because Paul is referencing that when he goes to, I think it was Jerusalem, right? He says he meets with Cephas,
Right.
and he does so for like 2 weeks, right? And then he says, I didn't see any of the other apostles or disciples, but I only saw James, the brother of the Lord. Now, the question would be like on the Galatians passage, why James is singled out among the other individuals in the passage. So
Well,
if you
because
have
the other individuals are apostles and they're not just general Christians, they're higher up in the hierarchy of Christianity.
but they would still be brothers of the Lord. It
They
doesn't
would
matter.
they
It doesn't
no
matter
they
whether or
would be
not.
brothers of the Lord, but this James would not be an apostle, which is different. It's very a very guarded thing for Paul because Paul only identifies apostles as those that have had a vision of Jesus, whereas general Christians would just be regular believers. Like they didn't receive a vision of Jesus or a revelation of Jesus. They just were Christian. So like that's the delineation that's being made there.
So the delineation that you're representing, I don't think it is being made there. I mean, I know we're going to disagree on this, but
Well, so how is it not
the
like the
delineation. So I
delineation?
mean, I don't want to go in. I don't want to go into like extra biblical resources, but when we go into Josephus, we can see like there's a claim that Jesus had a brother named James.
Yeah. So I would dispute the James passage in Josephus. I think that it originally mentioned this James as being a Ben Damnius rather than associated with Christ or with Jesus, like Jesus Christ. I think that it's more parsimonious if Josephus originally mentioned this James as a Ben Damnius, because later on in the passage, Jesus Ben Damnius is put in the place of that James who was unalived unjustly, and that was a typical the typical thing back then to show reconciliation or whatnot is to take a family member and put them in the position of the person that was unduly unalived, and so like that I think that's way more parsimonious than thinking that Josephus just randomly threw in, a random call to a Christ with no explanation about who Christ was, what a Christ was to the Jews, or anything like that.
Well, so that's actually where you get the delineation in Josephus, is the very fact that you have a descriptor. So are you familiar with like onomastic congruence?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Are you familiar with onomastic congruence?
Automastic congruence. I don't know that particular statement.
Okay, so it's basically the study of names in Howland on the notion of names themselves. So the names that are being used have to be consistent with the time period. If you have like really weird names that are thrown out that are not as consistent with the time period, they're just not going to be as congruent. But another notion is going to say, okay, there's constant qualifiers on onomastic congruence, that those qualifiers specifically are to make a distinction between the more popular names and the more non-popular names.
Okay, can you just like fast forward to the point?
Yeah, so the point would be this. We see in the calling of the disciples, we see a pattern, and we see it all actually in more than just the calling. I'll just use the calling of the disciples as an example. We see the qualifiers that are being offered, and they're only being applied to names specifically that are going to be more common. So when you get less common names, you don't have qualifiers. So I can give like an example. Let me pull it up real quick.
Well, I mean, how does this qualifier thing argument like play into brother of the Lord? Are you saying that the fact that the brother of the Lord, huh?
Yeah, that is the qualifier. It's to distinguish.
Yeah, but I understand. So I understand where you're going with this, but the word for brother that's used by Paul there means either a blood relative or a fictional kinship. So what evidence do you have to suggest that the title brother of the Lord can only mean blood relative and never means a fictional?
Is we also, I want to give another point as well, like, because we also see in Galatians, but let's hit this point first. We also see in Galatians that Paul talks about like being born of a woman, right? And that would be inconsistent with the spiritual notion of a non.
But the actual Greek words used there for born of a woman is actually more in line with made of a woman because of the word he uses. So he uses genao instead of genomai. Genomai is more explicit about birth, while genao is more about manufacturing. Like you would say that, you genao that pot, meaning you made that pot, or you made that pot come into existence by shaping it yourself. So like the actual word that's used there for born of a woman is actually made of a woman. This is actually in stark contrast to how it's used in the Old Testament, which Paul had access to. In the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, it specifically uses genomai of a woman. And in fact, if you look at Bart Ehrman, when he discusses these passages, he notes that there were later Christians that forced the genomai word in there because they felt like it was confusing to have genao in there when he's talking about being born of a woman. So, I mean, it seems like Paul specifically constructed this phrase to be made of a woman as a way of saying that his body wasn't born normally, but that he was fashioned in some kind of manufactured way.
Yeah, so being fashioned in some sort of manufactured way, what would that look like in a spiritual sense of a woman?
Of a woman? I mean, I think
so. Like, even if I accepted that,
right? I think that what Paul could have thought is that he could have read the scriptures and saw in it's somewhere in Samuel. It's like 1 Samuel 7 something or another, where God specifically tells David that I am going to take your seed and I am going to raise up, the Messiah, basically is what he's getting to. He's going to take his seed and raise up the Messiah. And so being born of a woman, meaning that he fashioned Jesus's body out of flesh, out of the sinful flesh, because all throughout the Bible, women are related to as being sinful, and that is where original sin originates from, which I know original sin, that concept comes much later. I was just using that to describe the fact that, this sin that is, imposed on human beings that, people need to absolve, through the temple ceremonies and everything like that in the Old Testament, and then through Jesus's sacrifice in the New Testament, is brought in through women. And so saying that, born of a woman, just means that he was fashioned of sinful flesh. And so yeah.
So, okay, we'll come back to that, because I do have the passage up where he calls the disciples. Oh, give me 1 second. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Yet again, my child needed me.
That's okay.
So, if you go to Luke 6, that's where you're going to find the names of the apostles, the names of the disciples in 13 through 16.
Okay.
Now, if we look at onomastic congruence, and if you want to look that up later, that's fine. So this is an argument that's presented by some pretty well-known scholars. One of them most recently has used it in reference. His name is Luc Van de Wey. I don't know if you've heard of him, but that's where other people have used it as well. People like Richard Balcom and so on and so forth. But when we look at the calling and we see, and when the day came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, who's he also named as apostles. Now notice what happens. You have qualifiers after specific names. And if you look at onomastic congruence, you can see these specific names actually relate to some of the more common names around the time period, whereas in the less common names don't have qualifiers.
Well,
so
Simon, are we talking about Gospels, or are we talking about the?
No. We're talking about how
Paul?
Ancient people wrote down.
I'm talking about how Paul writes.
No, but that's going to be consistent. So if you have
I don't understand how appealing to a different author and how a different author writes is going to tell us anything about Paul's use of brother of the Lord.
Yeah, so what it's going to tell us is it's going to give us a style of the time. It's going to give us a style of how they wrote, how they descripted, because of just the way they had their own database.
But how does that affect the definition of the word that Paul used for brother? I can't remember it right now. Adelphos. How does that affect the definition of Adelphos?
So it's going to raise. So remember when we talked earlier about the evidence on a Bayesian level, raising the probability of something, but you said you wanted to raise the likelihood that it's not referencing just a spiritual notion, but it's referencing more of a familial connection.
Okay.
So if I can just read this really quick. So Simon, who was also called Peter. So there's a qualifier with his name. Andrew, his brother. James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus. So a qualifier to distinguish from the other James. Simon, who was called the Zealot, a qualifier to distinguish from the other Simon. Judas, the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. We can also see this in other references as well. So the qualifiers help us understand at least why these things exist, why these names are being referenced, but also why they're being referenced with the qualifiers.
Well, right. And so like James, brother of the Lord, that would be James in the family of God. Like, I guess I don't understand your point.
Yeah. So when we look at Cephas being used there, right? Cephas, why is he not also like referenced as a brother of the Lord? Why is it just James? Why is it James?
Cephas was already identified as an apostle.
But what does that matter?
What does that matter? I mean,
I know you said I know you said about the hierarchy, and you said like Paul considered this hierarchy, so he didn't call. I think you said he didn't call the disciples by brother because they were like higher up.
Well, no, I mean, he already referenced them as an apostle. The apostle would be an apostle for Christ, right? Or an apostle for the Lord. So he's already designated as being part of the family of God. I mean, that's what that would be.
I'm sorry, I don't understand what you mean.
You don't understand how Jesus providing a revelation to somebody and that somebody accepting Jesus and being an apostle to spread his good word or his good news or his gospel makes him a part of the family of God?
No, I can understand how it makes him a part of the family of God.
Okay.
But so let me ask
it makes it superfluous to mention that he is also in the family of God, because it's already established that Peter or Cephas is in the family of God. Like, that's already it would be superfluous to say, oh, both of these guys are in the family of God, because apostles are already in the family of God. And in this situation, what he's delineating is between an apostle, somebody that's personally received revelation from Jesus, from somebody that has not received revelation of Jesus, and that they are just a general believer. That's the that's what's being distinguished there.
Okay, so how are you distinguishing that James from the 1 Corinthians James? How do you know it's a different James?
The 1 Corinthians James. You're talking about the James where? Like, oh, then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles?
Yeah, in 15, right? So if your delineation...
yeah.
If you understand my critique, right? If your delineation is going to say that this is only going to apply to the Jameses to which Jesus appeared, right? And so when Paul is writing this, James, the brother of Jesus, must be a different James, because this is a James
No. So it's not brother of Jesus. It's very specific. It's brother of the Lord, or the Lord's brother. Either way, it's the same thing.
Yeah. That's fine. We can keep the specificity of whatever you want to say.
It's very important. Like, if Paul had said the brother of Jesus, we would not be having this conversation. I would agree Jesus existed historically, and that Paul is admitting that this is a blood relative of Jesus. I mean, I don't think that would be enough to convince Carrier, because Carrier still has this question of like, well, there were plenty of fictional characters in history that say that they were brothers or relatives of fictional people, or of real people. Like, real people are saying that they are brothers or sisters, or they derive their lineage directly from these fictional people. And so, like, just him even saying brother of Jesus wouldn't suffice for Carrier. But I'm saying that, like, if it said brother of Jesus right here, I would be probably on the historicist side ever so slightly, and I personally would be convinced that he existed historically. But because it doesn't say that, like, that's why I think that this is more of a generic, like, Christian sort of label rather than any kind of like blood relation.
Okay, so respectfully, that didn't answer my question.
Okay.
So the question was, how are you delineating that it's a different James?
Yeah, I know. I was just being very specific about the Lord title there, because that's important, because that's
that's fine.
How I delineate, though, is that this James isn't identified as the same James that is an apostle. He's very specifically being isolated from the other apostle. I think that if this James was an apostle, then he would just be easily grouped in with Peter, who's already identified as an apostle, which automatically makes them part of the family of God or a Christian themselves. And so because of that fact, that he wouldn't need to specify that he's a brother of the Lord. He would just say, I saw no other brothers there, no other Christians other than these two guys. Like he would have just had to say that, like Cephas and James. Like he would have to then
we see
specify
that same
brother of the
honor.
Lord.
Well, we see that same honor given in the 1 Corinthians 15, right? He appeared to James, then to all the apostles, right? So there's a distinction that James is not one of the apostles. James at this point.
No, James is separate from the. Hold on, I got to bring up my. Where's. Crap. I had. Did I close
Talking about James, the apostle of Christ, and James, the one who writes, is what written about in Chronicles?
No.
Because they're not the same person.
So
I'm not sure what Chronicles has to do with this.
So he says, and then he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. Now he doesn't say Cephas is an apostle here, but Cephas, the fact that Jesus is appearing to them makes them an apostle. So like Cephas is an apostle. Then he appeared to more than 500. So that means that had been all the apostles had been Jesus had given a revelation to, and then last of all he appeared to Paul because he would have been the last apostle revealed.
Can I push back right there though? So you're kind of adding to the text when you add in those extra words.
Which words are extra?
So in between James and the apostles, right? So what the translation you just gave was what the text is saying is that he appeared to James and then the rest of the apostles. And the rest of the apostles, or that notion isn't supplied within the text.
No, well, so yes, I would say that I'm adding that, but that would be because of the definition that Paul gives to apostle, meaning that an apostle received direct revelation of Jesus. James would be an apostle by the fact that he received direct revelation. So that can only mean that, and then that means that next part, then to all the apostles, just means that it was completing the revelatory, the revelatory act to all of the apostles. So at that point, all the apostles that were going to be apostles had been, Jesus had been revealed to. And one of the last ones that was revealed to was Paul.
Okay, so when you're admitting like you're adding it in, that's kind of like it's begging the question specifically.
How is it begging the question?
So you're begging the question because you're including your conclusion within the premise.
No, I don't see how I'm including the conclusion in my premise.
Yeah, so you're saying it must be the case, right, that this James is also an apostle because he's seen the Lord, because apostles are only people who have ever seen the Lord.
Right, that's definitionally how Paul describes apostles. When he says in 1 Corinthians 15, when he talks about being abnormally born, and whenever he talks about what makes somebody an apostle, it's somebody that Jesus has revealed himself to, like post-resurrection. And so the mere fact that James is has had a revelatory experience, that makes him an apostle, which means by Paul's definition of what an apostle is, the then to all the apostles just means that Jesus was completing the action of revealing his gospel to the rest of the group that he was going to be revealed to. So
what verse are you referencing? Just out of curiosity,